is forthcoming from Grove Press in August. She received her MFA in nonfiction from Columbia, her BA in religious studies from Wesleyan, and blogs about the fine line between the two at thisweekineden.com.
So the book she's referring to, Paradise Lost, Searching for the Garden of Eden, beginning is out after the show. So I wrote a book about people who search for the Garden of Eden on Earth. And whenever I tell people this, the first question I usually get is it a true story? And I say, yes, it is actually a true story, which is confusing to people. Each chapter of the book focuses on a different real person who's actually looked for the Garden of Eden on Earth, on a map. All of them claim to be simply following the literal description of the garden from the Bible. Some examples. The first president of Boston University in 1881 insisted that the Garden of Eden had been at the North Pole. A British engineer found 2 different Gardens of Eden in Iraq, one in the north, one in the south. A Chinese newspaperman tried to prove that Eden was in outer Mongolia. So I like to think of this book as all these stories strung together as sort of a postmodern narrative patchwork history of the post-Darwin reckoning between science and religion. That's what I like to say anyway. Which is why I'm always surprised by the second question people usually ask me, which is, so where do you think it is? I never know how to answer this one. Isn't it obvious that I know the Garden of Eden is a made-up place and the idea that you can find it on Earth is crazy? Apparently it's not, which is actually my fault. I tried not to treat each of my Eden seekers, that's what I call them, like crazy people. Instead, I tried to take each of them at their word and follow their logic as far as it was possible, on the assumption that these highly intelligent people who've written whole books about why the Garden of Eden is a real place and where it might be found must have some urgent reason for doing so. As my first advanced review recently put it, she treats her characters with respect, sometimes more than they deserve. Fair enough. I actually like that part. And so, acknowledging that someone who writes a whole book about other people's searches for the Garden of Eden must be nearly as obsessed as her characters are, I thought tonight would be a good time to come clean about my own motivations. So by way of answering that second question, where do you think it is, I'm going to tell you a true story about me. In the beginning. I'm kidding. I grew up in Down East Maine in a small working-class town on the edge of Acadia National Park. My parents were wannabe back-to-the-landers who'd moved there in the 70s, and they created a little countercultural bubble in which to raise me and my little brother. We had no TV, we ate brown rice and we ate tofu, and we kept the Whole Earth catalog in a prominent place on our bookshelf. One spring weekend when I was in 3rd grade, I was hanging out at my friend Emily's house down the road, and her parents asked if I wanted to go with them to something called the Good News Club. I said, sure, why not? Good news sounded good. So we piled into their car and we drove to a neighbor's house where there was already a group of kids sitting on the floor upstairs, listening politely to a man who was telling a story. When we got there, he was talking about Easter, which was coming up. I knew about Easter because that was one of the few occasions where Mom let us have chocolate in the house. Usually we had to settle for carob, no good. But that was all Easter meant to me. I had no idea who Jesus was or why he got nailed to a piece of wood. It certainly didn't sound like good news, and I didn't see what it had to do with me. Then he got to the important part. Here's how I remember him telling it. I was 8, so it's one day soon, maybe next week, you'll just be walking down the street and you'll hear the sound of a trumpet, really loud. Everyone all over the world will hear this trumpet. And that will be the signal that the world is about to end. The earth is going to burst into flame, criminals will roam the streets, and everybody left on earth will die. That's what will happen to you unless you believe in Jesus. People who take Jesus into their hearts will be automatically whooshed up into heaven when this trumpet calls, where they can live forever in a peaceful, happy place full of good people. So everyone has to make a choice. Believe in Jesus, go to heaven, live forever. Don't believe in Jesus, stay on earth, die a horrible death. I'm going to give you a chance to make that choice now. It's easy. If you want to take Jesus into your heart, all you have to do is bow your heads. That's it. Just bow your heads right now, no problem, and when the trumpet calls, you'll be taken up to heaven. Heads drop all around me. But I'm sitting there, head up, getting to panic. Why hadn't I been told about this? This seemed like a really important decision that my parents ought to have prepared me for. They were always talking about being honest with us and treating us like adults, and they hadn't told me this. So I tried to think it through, logically. I figured they never said anything about Jesus. So I figured they hadn't taken him into their hearts, right? So if I did bow my head and stayed on earth, at least I'd be with them before I died my horrible death. But I wasn't sure about my grandmother. My grandmother lived far away in Albany, New York, and I had no idea what she thought about Jesus. What if she had already taken him into her heart? Then when the trumpet called, we'd be separated and I'd never see her again. Since I only got to see her once a year as it was, at Christmas, that seemed particularly cruel. So I'd like to pause at this suspenseful moment. Did I or did I not bow my head and get saved? To call attention to the fact that never once did I conceive that this story about the trumpet and the end of the world was not true. The man who told the story clearly believed it. And why would anybody lie to themselves about something so important as the end of the world, let alone to a bunch of kids? I must not have bowed my head, because the next thing I remember is running home to my parents and asking them, "Does Nana believe in Jesus?" Blank stares. 25 years later, both my parents tell me they'd never seen me so angry. I started to explain what the man told us. I'm sure they said, "That's not true," but I didn't believe them. It felt true, and they weren't convincing at all. It occurs to me now that my parents must have been just as panicked as I was. They had read all the books about how to talk so kids will listen, and listen so kids will talk. They had their story straight about the birds and the bees, drinking and drugs, but the religion thing they had not considered. I have to give them credit. They tried. Different people believe different things. But when it came to the end of the world, life and death, heaven and hell, these things were not so fluid. They either were or they were not. My mother tried to remember what she'd learned in Hebrew school all those years ago about what happens after you die. Something about your body decomposing and your soul living on in other people's memories. My father said something about everything being made of matter and spirit. This was hardly satisfying. I was 8 years old, and I knew there was a right answer. My parents, all they knew was that I suddenly had an insatiable appetite for all things religious. I think they thought if they gave me enough of it, gave me enough different samples, that I would get it out of my system and not bother them with it again. But I kept bringing up Jesus. So they figured they should start with the Catholics. But there was no way the local hippies could show their face at St. Peter's Catholic Church on Manset Road without attracting far too much of the wrong kind of attention. So they waited until they had a friend from out of town visiting, when Margaret McAvoy, who'd been raised Catholic but seemed to find it amusing that she was still considered faithful enough for the job. Fortunately, St. Peter's was far too boring to make any impression whatsoever on me. Next, my parents wanted something closer to home, to their own beliefs, so they turned to Riva, a fellow 70s migrant to Maine who my father liked to describe mysteriously as a philosophy major at Mount Holyoke, to teach me about Buddhism. Unfortunately, Riva's explanation of reincarnation, when you die, you don't actually die, but keep getting reborn into different bodies until you reach some kind of enlightenment, was almost as scary to me as the idea of the trumpet call. That was no good. Finally, my parents found a religious establishment that they could actually take me to without compromising any of their non-beliefs, the local Unitarian Church. They went to the regular service, and they sent my brother and I downstairs to Sunday school, where we didn't have to hear anything about Jesus or the apocalypse or reincarnation. Our activity for the week was an exercise in interfaith tolerance. We were given big rolls of butcher paper and crayons and asked to draw our own Muslim prayer rugs. Confusing. So my parents must have figured that if they wanted to teach their children the golden rule and basic morality, they could have done so just as easily at home, which is what they did. But my obsession with religion continued. I memorized children's prayer books from the library. I constructed tiny crosses and stars of David from pieces of the bamboo thing that grew behind our house. In college, this went on, I majored in comparative religion because you didn't have to pick concentration. Concentration in English, but not religion. The weirder the juxtaposition between different belief systems, the more comfortable I felt. I took courses in Islamic history, Afro-Caribbean religions, the Old Testament. I spent a semester in Bali studying Hinduism. After college, my first temp job was at a Lutheran church in Minnesota, where I was living with a house full of goth pagans. At first, the different true stories presented to me by my parents, science, Judaism, reincarnation, Unitarians, Muslims, Catholics, seemed all to be offered as alternatives to the terrifying absolutism of the Good News Club. You shouldn't believe that story, but here are some religions you might like. Pick one and take it all the way. But probably by the time I was in college, it was clear to me that I could never be a religious person in the complete sense like those people because I hadn't been born into it. What I had been born into, though, was this door-to-door buffet-style approach. I was a fundamental relativist. Don't tell me there's only one way to explain the world. Don't tell me there's only one Garden of Eden. The next true story is always more interesting than the last. I was left with the hunger for true stories about the impossible. Where do we go when we die? What does God look like? I never knew what the motivation of that man from the Good News Club was, but I knew he was sincere. Just like I know that the Chinese guy I researched really did believe that the Garden of Eden was in Mongolia. And who am I to say it's not?